Hello everyone, welcome to Doctrina Mundi. Today we are going to talk about Adam Smith and his discussion of prudence. Who does not know him? As soon as economics comes into our minds, we are directed towards his concepts of the division of labor and the invisible hand, to name just a handful. But today we are going to talk about him as a moral philosopher, not as an economist. It should be remembered that for 13 years he was the chair of moral philosophy department at Glasgow University. Economics has not yet at the time become a subject to be studied on its own. He taught logic and moral philosophy, compiling his lecture notes and then publishing his first major book in 1759, not on economics but on moral philosophy, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Our focus today will be on this book. In it, he addresses the main arguments and philosophical problems current in his times, raised by formidable figures like Hutcheson and Hume. Hutcheson, on the one hand, argued for the supremacy of the intuitive moral sense that helps us form moral judgments, whereas Hume focused on passion and degraded reason as a slave to passions when it comes to approving or disapproving something. Smith set out to address this conflict regarding the seat of moral judgment and comes up with the thesis that every moral judgment takes into consideration two elements, passion and sympathy. His academic career started in 1748 at University of Edinburgh and ended in 1763 when he began tutoring and working on his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations. The economic aspect of moral philosophy was not well spelled out in the philosophical departments, therefore he set out to fill this gap in philosophical literature. We can see the formation of his economic concepts, especially their assumptions of self-interest and moral utility underlying them, analyzed in detail in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. One of the most important moral virtue in economic matters is prudence, so let's see what he has to say about it in this book. It is addressed in the 6th part of the book. He introduces this part thus: when we consider the character of any individual, we naturally view it under two different aspects, as it may affect his own happiness and as it may affect that of other people. We are primarily concerned with the first aspect. What characteristics does prudence have and how does it affect our individual happiness? Smith first tells us what do we think about when we talk about prudence. He says, the care of the health, the fortune, and the rank and reputation of the individual, these being the items on which his comfort and happiness in this life are supposed principally to depend, is regarded as the proper business of the virtue commonly called prudence. So health, fortune, rank, and social reputation need to be taken care of by a prudent man. After this brief introduction regarding prudence, he sets out 7 principles of prudence. The first principle is security. He claims, for that reason, the first and the principal object of prudence is security. Prudence is opposed to our exposing our health, our fortune, our rank, or our reputation to any sort of risk. It is cautious rather than enterprising and more concerned to preserve the advantages that we already possess than to prompt us to the acquisition of still greater advantages. And then he applies this principle to the management of finances. The methods of improving our fortune that it principally recommends to us are the ones that don't involve risk, real knowledge and skill in our trade or profession, hard work and persistence in the exercise of it, frugality to the point of parsimony in all our expenses. This link between a virtue like prudence and wage earning is underscored by the essential material condition under which every human spends his or her life. So the first thing that Smith wants us to understand is that there is a healthy relationship between virtue and money. In economics and finance courses, we study that every return is measured against the risk it entails, and then a prudent decision is taken to go through with the project or not. The second principle of prudence is attentive observation and gathering of knowledge. He says, the prudent man always studies seriously and earnestly to understand whatever he professes to understand, and not merely persuade other people that he understands it, and though his talents may not always be brilliant, they are perfectly genuine. There cannot be any decision without information. So much so that nowadays data is known as digital gold, because once we have data, let's say about consumer purchases, we look into patterns that can guide a business in making future decisions. In the same way, every prudent man relies on his own knowledge and abilities and do not get involved with others because he is well informed. So there is an element of not over-attaching oneself with others. Smith provides a self-interested reason for this behavior. If he, the prudent person, ever connects himself with any society of any kind, it is merely in self-defense, not with a view to impose upon the public, but to hinder the public from being imposed upon, to his disadvantage by the clamors, the whispers, or the intrigues, either of that particular society or of some other of the same kind. The prudent motivation for information gathering and getting involved in economic gains is not to impose oneself on others, but to stay a step ahead of others while keeping a distance from their vices. The third principle of prudence is sincerity, but this is a very measured kind of sincerity, as he has already mentioned that socializing must be prudently managed so that one stays away from the harms of society. He explains, the prudent man is always sincere. He hates the thought of exposing himself to the disgrace that comes from the detection of falsehood. But though always sincere, he isn't always frank and open. He never says anything that isn't true, but he doesn't always think he is obliged to volunteer the whole truth. To match his cautious way of acting, he is reserved in his speech and never forces on people his opinions about anything or anyone. In this principle, as with other principles above, we can see restraint and caution as the main driving force. Alertness of mind is required when being sincere, because sincere people are usually simple people, pretty much like transparent glass, because sincerity demands frankness, but a prudent man is frank for a self-interested reason. Hence, he would always keep an eye on the information that must not be given such that his interests are undermined. The fourth principle of prudence is related to the third, practical networking. Unless one has the capacity to make friends, one cannot gather information. And it should be kept in mind that getting information out of someone is really hard. Therefore, Smith is talking about trustworthy, sincere friendships which can be only sustained if one is not too friendly. General sociability never attracts trust, because no one trusts a sincere person who meets and talks a lot. He would say anything to anyone. Therefore, prudence recommends us to make friends, but again to reiterate, not to become too social. Smith recommends he rarely frequents and rarely figures in those convivial societies which are distinguished for jollity and gaiety for their conversation. Then he explains the reason why this should be so, which again harks back to self-interest. Their way of life might too often interfere with the regularity of his temperance, might interrupt the steadiness of his industry, or break in upon the strictness of his frugality. One has to be sincere but not passionately attached to others. Human relationships have a pull of their own, depending on one's personal desires and preferences. If someone is a regular party goer, then the more friends he would have, the more chances of getting invites, which would involve him more in socializing, and his industry would be affected. Prudence requires sincere friendships but devoid of passion. The fifth principle of prudence is decency and humility. A prudent man guards his tongue when speaking. He stays away from inappropriate use of language because it will hurt his self-reputation. Smith asserts that the prudent man hates the thought of being guilty of any petulance or rudeness. In both conduct and conversation, he strictly preserves decency and is almost religiously scrupulous in maintaining all the established decorums and ceremonials of society. Conversation is a very important part of establishing relationships. Our rhetoric is our worth. What we speak, how we speak, why we speak all matter a lot. In this principle, the focus is on how we speak. Prudence in speech requires us to talk in the manner common in society, without overstepping the boundary of decency to establish a closer relationship. Usually, the informal, indecent conversation is considered a mark of sincerity. Often friends speak among themselves without any reservation, which is what strengthens the friendship, makes it more passionate, so to say. But that is what precisely Smith is warning against. It is in our self-interest that we keep the possibility in mind that if circumstances change, which they always do, then friends of today can easily become enemies of tomorrow. And the same principle applies to enemies. It is possible that someone whom we consider an enemy today might turn out to be an important friend in the future. The sixth principle of prudence is frugality. Smith says that the man who lives within his income is naturally contented with his situation, which by continual, though small accumulations, is growing better and better every day. There are two things to note here. First, containment of desires, because a prudent man never borrows money. That is what within his income means. And secondly, be patient. Through patience and savings, the accumulation of wealth can happen smoothly. Our desires are made through our preferences and habits. If we are able to contain our desires and become habituated in restrained desires, then even if one becomes rich from being a rag, his desires would not alter drastically. His preferences will always take into account the slowly accumulating wealth and savings that need to be put aside for future, because it is one of the most important habits of a prudent man. Foreseeing the future and preparing for it financially requires a lot of courage and self-control. Smith gives an example of prudent investment as its returns would be reaped in the future. Defining the characteristics of a prudent investor, he says that he, the prudent investor, can never be hurried or drove into them by any necessity, but has always time and leisure to deliberate soberly and coolly concerning what are likely to be their consequences. Prudence requires us to take care of our future ourselves, because it is in our self-interest that we remain independent now and also in the future. And it is only us who can really care about our future, not anyone else. The seventh and the last principle of prudence, according to Smith, is a simple advice: don't meddle in others' affairs. It is more of a reminder than a principle, as he has already talked about the care one has to take when meeting other people and making friends. Smith further clarifies this principle. The prudent man is unwilling to undertake any responsibility that his duty does not impose on him. He doesn't bustle in matters where he has no concern, doesn't meddle in other people's affairs, doesn't set himself up as a counselor or advisor, pushing his advice at people who haven't asked for it. Keep out of others' business. It is as simple as that. All of these principles sound more egoistic than virtuous, and Smith knows that. As a conclusive remark, he says, in short, when prudence aims merely at taking care of the individual person's health, fortune, and rank and reputation, though it is regarded as a most respect-worthy and even somewhat likable and agreeable quality, it is never regarded as one of the most endearing or ennobling of the virtues. It commands a certain cold esteem, but seems not to be entitled to any ardent love or admiration. A prudent man does not necessarily possess agreeable qualities, but it is necessary that he does not, because he has to balance passion against sympathy. He has to be sympathetic towards others, but passionate about oneself. He has to take care of others, not to win love and admiration, because then passion is misdirected. He has to take care of others with prudence, which would generate esteem. Whether it be cold or passionate, esteem is what brings social reputation and allows self-interested ventures to thrive without hindrance of passionate feelings. That is Adam Smith laying down the moral justification for the economic theory he would present in The Wealth of Nations. Thank you, everyone.